Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beneath the Empire, the podcast where literature meets psychology, philosophy, and power. I'm your host, Melanie Seremet. I'm a literary researcher who focuses on Russian literature, specifically Dostoevsky's work, and have a major in psychology from Cornell University. This podcast is inspired by my extensive reading of Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. While I was reading, I was struck by the underground man's intense inner conflict, his contradicting thoughts, his isolation and bitterness, and how it seemed to fuel his oppressive behavior. And it led me to question mankind's oppressive nature myself. The connection led me to an even larger question. Could this novella help explain the inner roots of historical oppression, particularly what compels one to colonize? Now, the existing scholarship on this novella largely focuses on the underground man's conflicting psychology, but what they've yet to explore is how this mindset might drive a colonial thirst for power. Psychological research on colonialism also tends to focus on the experience of the colonized, making the mindset of the colonizer largely unexplored territory. Desperate for answers, I started researching, analyzing the underground man as representative of a colonizer, an interpretation supported by the cultural tensions in Imperial Russia at the time, and his desire to surpass and oppress. This perspective led to some powerful insights. Today, I seek to bridge these gaps, to show how this incredibly insightful novella offers a valuable lens for understanding the psychological motivations of colonizers. I hope scholars in cultural studies, philosophy, and psychology will recognize the underground man as a useful prototype for the inner workings of power. Through this analysis, one can attain a deeper understanding of how domination manifests across politics and across society, and have the tools to dismantle such hierarchies. Before we begin, it's important to outline the criteria by which I'll evaluate this novella in relation to my research. When I talk about the psychological motivations of colonizers, I'm referring to the internal forces that push someone to dominate or dehumanize others. However, I'd like to be more specific with this definition in the context of colonialism. So, I will use the following subcriteria, seeing if and how the underground man possesses the following: the inner construction of a capital O other, a conflicted psychological desire for this other, a predisposition that psychologically motivates him to act on that desire, and a core psychological factor that perpetuates this behavior. Without further ado, let's jump right in and rewrite history. Before we dive in, I'd like to introduce my friend Nico, who's joining us as a special guest today to share his thoughts alongside mine. He is a researcher in cultural studies and psychology at University of Wisconsin.
Hello everyone, happy to be here today.
I want to start off by exploring why the underground man creates this us versus them dynamic throughout the novella, which closely mirrors colonial structures. He contrasts the so-called ingenuous man, whom he sees as stupid and naive, but sincere, with the man of action, who he criticizes as overly conscious, and ironically, we know that this is a trait he embodies. He also mocks the Russian romantic figure, someone who publicly upholds lofty ideals and chases personal gain. But what's especially ironic is that he admits to admiring the very type of ingenuous man he critiques for seeking this individual profit. He too harbors lofty ideals, but he represses them. Instead, he chooses to chase what he calls rational profit and remain trapped in this hyperconscious mind that he even refers to as a sickness.
And just to be clear, by rational profit, you mean desire for solely material success. And on the other hand, individual profit is having free will in what you do for a living despite the social gain?
Yes, exactly.
So, why do you think he clings to this sick, hyperconscious identity while repressing and even mocking the very ideals he admires?
Well, when we consider his references to the romantic man and rational profit, it becomes clear that his inner conflict isn't just personal, right? It's deeply rooted in cultural values and these societal expectations. So I started digging into the historical context, and I came across this incredible piece by Dominick LaCapra. In his chapter, Notes from Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, LaCapra explains that when Dostoevsky wrote this novel, Russia was undergoing a rapid westernization due to Enlightenment ideals. This created a huge ideological split in the country between the Westernizers, who pushed for modernization, and these radical groups like the Slavophiles, who clung to Russia's traditional values. Dostoevsky actually aligned with the latter.
Interesting. So, the underground man's ideals can be separated into two categories: those he consciously aligns with and those he forcefully represses. The former being enlightened and westernized, centered around rationality and profit, while the latter being romantic and radical ideals, such as the Slavophiles, with focus on emotion and individualism in Russia's traditional values.
Exactly. And this psychic division caused by this sort of social mass mindedness resembles what psychoanalyst Carl Jung speaks of in his collection of essays called The Undiscovered Self. Being that Jung was a foundational figure in the development of early psychoanalysis, he founded analytical or Jungian psychology, which remains widely universally studied today. He has so many influential concepts, such as the collective unconscious, archetypes, and introversion versus extroversion, which continue to shape psychological thought and, like I said, are still studied to this day. Originally published by Berkeley, The Undiscovered Self explores the interplay between the conscious and unconscious mind, which was a key idea of Jung's and will be extremely relevant for this podcast. In the first chapter, The Plight of Individuals in Modern Society, Jung explores the division between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And essentially, he's redefining the conscious, arguing that it holds an ingenuine sense of self, and it's a target for collective forces like the state and ideological fanaticism, that it's grounded in conformity and external validation and scientific rationalism. And conversely, he defines the unconscious as a place that harbors repressed true individuality and true desires. He refers to this as the shadow. So Jung believed that when external forces like the state demand what he calls mass mindedness, people suppress their authentic parts of themselves. In chapter 6, Self Knowledge, Jung warns that neglecting the unconscious rather than confronting it creates a fear of the shadow within. Thus, he says that when one is faced with political conflict, such as colonialism, right, this shadow in the colonizer is projected onto a capital O other. So, considering Jung's argument, it's clear that the underground man isn't just having conflicted thoughts, right? He's torn between his conscious identity and his unconscious identity, a split psyche. Russia and its dominating ideals are encroaching upon his consciousness, pulling him away from his unconscious shadow, where his individualistic, romantic self lies. And that's why he calls his overly conscious mind a sickness. It's quite literally a target for the state to promote a collective identity. And while he does truly despise that identity, he is unable to escape it out of fear of uncovering this unfamiliar shadow within. Instead, he also projects his shadow onto an other.
And who would be the other in this novella?
Liza. She's everything the underground man is not: naive, compassionate, virtuous, and emotionally grounded.
That makes sense. Her outlook aligns with the underground man's repressed identity, composed of romantic ideals like emotional depth and individuality. She's essentially untouched by the westernized, rationalist values he feels obligated to conform to. In that way, she is someone who literally reflects his feared and unfamiliar shadow. She is everything he critiques and seeks to suppress himself.
Precisely. And out of fear of confronting his authentic self, since it is in opposition to what the state has collectively forced upon him, he pushes it onto someone else.
Could there be another explanation for this whole phenomenon?
So I want to bring up a piece I read by Susan Van Zyl called The Other and the Other Others, Post-Colonialism, Psychoanalysis, and the South African Question. Van Zyl has extensive experience in her field, serving as Mellon's senior research mentor at the University of Witwatersrand and contributing to high-profile cases in South Africa's legal system, establishing her as a respected scholar in psychoanalysis and post-colonial theory. Her work, published in American Imago, a peer-reflected journal co-founded by Freud, which focuses on psychoanalysis and cultural theory, reflects her expertise in both psychology and cultural law, making her insights especially valuable to this podcast. Thus, her incredible ideas throughout this article totally reframed how I understood the underground man's attachment to a false identity and his creation of an other. Van Zyl critiques Freud's theory of fetishism, often used to explain the creation of this other, as too limited since it's rooted in male castration anxiety and a narrow familial structure. Instead, she focuses on Freud's Oedipus complex, where children repress desire for the opposite sex parent and instead identify with the same sex parent due to social taboos or societal expectations. Van Zyl applies this to colonialism, arguing that we've been conditioned to separate desire from identification, creating a binary logic that locks us into rigid identities. This helps explain why colonizers struggle to identify with those that are physically different from them, but that they unconsciously desire, the other. So I mentioned those two opposing cultural values from LaCapra's work, the pressure to conform to a dominated, westernized, rational society, and I think that Van Zyl's theory really builds on that.
Okay, that makes sense. Considering Van Zyl's ideas, when one ideology is seen as correct and the other as radical, it pushes society into forced homogeneity. So people are taught it's right to identify with dominant values.
Exactly, and Van Zyl points out that we've been conditioned to keep identification and desire in separate spheres. So if we extend her idea of binary logic beyond just physical appearance, it helps explain why the underground man feels pressured to conform to these mass enlightenment ideals like the rational profit mindset, which is tied to the westernization of Russia. But more importantly, it sheds light on why he admires this other he's created, the romantic, ingenuous man. Even though this figure is free from his sickness, he can't truly identify with him because of dominant social values or taboos and his internalized Oedipus complex. These forces ultimately distance him from his unconscious desires and identity.
Right. So both Jung and Van Zyl give us different lenses to understand the underground man and the colonizer's creation of the other, and also why there might be an unconscious desire for that other.
And what's key here is that these psychological patterns, they're inherent. They are present in all of us, but then they're manipulated by the state or society, which further fractures the colonizer's psyche and identity, which they physically project outward.
When you first brought this initial research question, I thought it was something that applied to specific people.
Same, but now it makes sense. This reading of the novella shows how the colonizer's psyche, and by extension their identity, is gradually fractured by the forceful, culturally turbulent society that they're part of. That leads to the creation of an other, which we see both in their split psyche and in how the Oedipus complex plays out beyond childhood desire. The novella really captures that idea of a fractured psyche and an unconscious longing for the other. And that brings us to our next point, how certain groups act on this fractured psyche to their advantage. So we've talked about how the colonizer's fractured psyche leads to this creation of a desired other using the novella. But what bridges the gap between a desire and actually acting on that desire? In part one, the underground man's resentment is internal. In part two, it turns outward and he lashes out. But why?
Right, so what happens between parts 1 and 2 that makes him act?
Mainly his participation in Zerkov's friend group. Zerkov is heavily admired for his wealth or rational profit. It seems to be what the group revolves around. They openly boast about their social status, money, success. And while the underground man unconsciously despises these ideals, he consciously wants to be accepted by the group, partly for social validation, referring to our discussion on Jung, but also out of spite. However, during dinner, when the underground man shows emotion and vulnerability, he's shamed and he's perceived as weak. Later, he projects those same intensified, rational ideals onto Liza, going as far as to make her burst into tears.
But why does he seek to impose their ideals onto Liza if he truly resents them?
So this concept is explained well in Rebecca Littman and Elizabeth Levy Paluck's article, The Cycle of Violence, Understanding Individual Participation in Collective Violence, which argues how group dynamics can initiate violent behavior in individuals. Littman and Levy Paluck argue that when things like social status or group identity are promised, people become less resistant to violence. And this is because of the group's praised values like power or moral superiority make harmful actions feel less psychologically distressing. This explains how, when social validation is at stake, individuals are more likely to follow the authority figure's motives, even if those motives go against what they would normally support.
Right, and tying that into Jung and Van Zyl, it's important to point out that the underground man's fractured psyche is conditioned to conform, to submit to collective authority. He's been trained to follow the masses.
Exactly, and he even says himself,
That man does dirty because he does not know his real interests.
So he ends up becoming a vessel for their group ideology, especially since he's been conditioned to chase after rational profit and the praise it brings. That process suppresses his individuality. And Jung tells us that people project their unconscious desires onto another because they fear confronting those hidden parts of themselves. That's where the underground man is stuck. He hasn't faced that repressed self, so he serves as a follower in the group.
which is exactly why he spirals after the pivotal dinner scene. When he steps outside of the group's rigid, rational identity and he starts expressing this emotional side of himself, the one that's buried in his unconscious, like we talked about with LaCapra and Jung, he's insistently mocked. And that's what triggers this deep fear, a fear of losing his place in the group, fear of shedding this homogenous identity he's always depended on. That fear of being pushed out of the group and confronted with his own other within becomes a primary cause, a justification for wanting revenge and asserting dominance. This is even an important idea he reiterates, that conscious, rational men can't take action because they're filled with doubt and have no motivation to, or the primary cause. But he adds that,
And so you just wave it aside because you haven't found the primary cause. But try getting blindly carried away by your feelings without reasoning, without a primary cause, driving consciousness away, at least for a time. Start hating or fall in love, only so as not to sit with folded arms.
so this is exactly what happens at the dinner. He's blindly carried away by his feelings.
So the emotional violence toward Liza, the other, isn't just cruel for cruelty's sake. It's targeted. She represents that unconscious part of himself, as we spoke about in the last episode, the part he tried to express at dinner and got punished for.
Exactly. And by hurting her, he isn't just lashing out, right? He's silencing that part of himself that the group shamed or rejected to reassert his alignment with their ideals, or regain social validation, and therefore his own conscious identity. And this is where Littman and Levy Paluck's idea of moral justification becomes super important. So Littman and Levy Paluck explain how groups lower the psychological barriers to violence by dehumanizing people through language and by reframing their ideals as morally superior. That way, the harm that they're causing feels justified, even helpful. And this connects to Hussein Bulhan's concept of metacolonialism in the article Stages of Colonialism in Africa, from occupation of land to occupation of being. Bulhan argues that colonialism evolved from being physical to psychological conquest, what he calls metacolonialism. It invades not just land, but identity. Colonizers don't just conquer with weapons, they built up self aggrandizing ideals that position themselves as superior. These ideals are eventually internalized by the colonized, distorting their sense of self. So, building on Littman and Levy Paluck's work, I'd argue that an empire's moral justification in oppression is based on the hope that the colonized will internalize their colonial values. By framing assimilation of their ideals as beneficial, they mask the reality of the oppression. And this doesn't just make oppression feel virtuous, it acts on the colonizer's fractured psyche, as they cling to group ideals to avoid confronting the other within themselves. So let's explain using notes from Underground. So, as we mentioned, Zervkov's group upholds a rational, homogeneous identity and mocks the underground man for failing to live up to their version of success. They call him poor, useless, while they boast about their own status, and reinforcing the illusion in him that conforming to their ideals is socially advantageous. And this exploitation of the underground man's fractured psyche we discussed in our last episode reinforces his belief that conforming to collective rationality isn't just imperative, it's beneficial and praised. He starts to accept their judgments, further suppressing his own values in favor of the group's. And then later, he replicates that same logic when imposing the group's ideals onto Liza. He convinces himself that he's helping her, just like the group convinced him. This comes through clearly when he imagines saying to her,
But now you are mine. You are my creation. You are pure. You are good. You are my noble wife.
the hope that she will internalize the group's ideals thus allows him to excuse the cruelty of his behavior. By reframing domination as moral guidance, he's distancing himself from the violence of the act, making it not just bearable, but even more psychologically motivating to act in the name of Zerkov's group.
That totally makes sense. So, basically, groups with authority, like empires, ease the psychological burden of colonization and assimilation of the colonized by taking advantage of the colonizer's fractured psyche, by framing the colonizer's actions as altruistic and beneficial for the colonized.
Exactly. And these psychologically fractured colonizers, who Jung and Van Zyl describe as conditioned to conform, are thus especially vulnerable to group influence. As Littman and Levy Paluck explain, individuals become more willing to use violence in the pursuit of status and glory when it's promised in the group, right? We discussed this. For the colonizer, conforming to these group ideals, it protects their fragile conscious identity, and it helps them avoid confronting the repressed other within. Thus, expressing individuality feels dangerous, right? It risks group rejection and it deepens the colonizer's fear of confronting what they've repressed. So ultimately, colonizers suppress the other in themselves through others by adopting the group ideals as a form of self preservation. Their oppressive behavior becomes morally justified when framed as helping the colonized internalize these supposedly superior values. And this allows colonizers to feel virtuous, even as they inflict harm. And ultimately, it's these psychological mechanisms within these collective groups that psychologically drive the colonizer's impulse to dominate, all in the name of the empire.
Темная ночь, только пули свистят по степи, только ветер гудит.
Now that we've explored what drives colonizers to act on the other, let's ask, why does this conquest keep repeating? What sustains oppression in the colonizer's mind? And to answer that, we'll look at the underground man's treatment of Liza and how she responds alongside various works. When he yells at her, Liza barely pushes back, and this submission only encourages him more. Through Bulhan's lens, this exemplifies internalization, when the colonized begin to accept the colonizer's ideals and remain silenced. Bulhan says that this helps maintain the status quo by distorting the colonized person's sense of reality. This lack of resistance in the colonized is echoed across many platforms as well. For example, Andrew Sage's YouTube video, The Psychology of Colonialism. In this section, The Colonized Who Accepts, Sage explains that colonized individuals who are surrounded by the colonizer's language start to believe in their own inferiority, and they start to view the colonizer's ideals as superior, adopting and embracing them into their own culture. We also see this in Liza. Rather than resisting, she begins asking questions to understand the underground man. Even after he purposely exploits her and imposes his worldview onto her harshly, she agrees to meet him again, still desperate to understand and connect with him. These forms of internalization are crucial for understanding what sustains the desire for colonization within the colonizer's mind. We've already discussed Jung's concept on the split psyche, where the colonizer's repressed unconscious is projected onto an other. Well, according to Bulhan, when colonized individuals internalize the colonizer's ideals as superior, they help preserve the status quo, right? Well, their silence then plays a crucial role in keeping the colonizer's unconscious other suppressed, allowing the colonizer to avoid confronting the part of themselves that they fear.
The colonizer doesn't have to confront the part of themselves they fear. They project it outward, and when that projection doesn't fight back, when it submits, they feel validated. Thus, their fractured psyche remains untouched. Their ego stays dominant, and domination feels justified because their sense of self remains unchallenged.
Precisely. And this is where Van Ziel's work really adds a whole other layer. Building on her insights from episode 2 about the Oedipus complex, she suggests that colonizer's identity is unconsciously shaped by the other. Now, combine that with Sage's argument that the colonized often begin to accept or embrace the colonizer's values, and it becomes clear the colonizer's identity is bolstered by the colonized body, reflecting those ideals back at them. It becomes a kind of affirming psychological mirror. As I mentioned, Liza begins surrendering, not just emotionally, but ideologically, to the underground man's frame of mind. And when the underground man senses that Liza is truly taking in the weight of his worldview, he admits himself,
I had felt for some time that I was turning her soul upside down and rending her heart, and the more I was convinced of it, the more eagerly I desired to gain my object as quickly and as effectually as possible.
In a nutshell, he's literally fueled by her submission and acceptance of his imposed ideals. It feeds his superiority complex. Her vulnerability confirms his dominance, and calling her an object, something to be gained or conquered, strips her of humanity. It links back to Littman and Levy Paluck's point about how language makes it easier to justify group oppression. When you strip someone of humanity, it becomes easier to exploit them in service of an ideal.
amazing point. And ultimately, our main takeaway from this episode is this. The colonized people's internalization and embracement of the colonizer's self-aggrandizing ideals reinforces the colonizer's already fractured psyche. The colonized people's silence doesn't just maintain the status quo, it actively keeps the colonizer from confronting their repressed unconscious identity. Meanwhile, their embracement of these ideals feeds into an even more inflated confidence within the colonizer's identity. In turn, this fuels repeated acts of domination. Conquest doesn't resolve the colonizer's psyche, it deepens the fracture. It drives the cycle of oppression and empire building we've explored throughout this whole entire podcast.
Мне кажется порою, что солдат с кровавых не пришедшие.
Okay, so as we've seen today, Notes from Underground fulfills each of the criteria I set out at the beginning of this podcast. It reveals the manifestation of an other in colonizer, explores the conflicted desire for that other, demonstrates a psychological predisposition to act on the desire, and it exposes a deeper psychological factor which sustains it all. But the novel doesn't stop there. So, considering all the thinkers we've explored today, Dostoevsky's work doesn't just meet the benchmarks I laid out, it pushes them even further. And analyzing the underground man as a colonizer in this culturally turbulent, westernizing Russian society, it really gives us a deeper and more layered look at the inner forces that drive imperial violence. The novella portrays these motivations by illustrating how the colonizer's universal psyche, and by extension identity, is shaped by the forceful pressures of the state and societal expectations. These internal fractures are then exploited by dominant collective groups, whose violent intent not only deepens the psychological split, but it also provides justification for their oppressive actions. So, colonialism is not just sustained merely through external domination, but through the colonized internalizing and embracing the colonizer's ideals. Processes that reinforce the colonizer's fractured psyche. And as a result, conquest becomes a self-justifying cycle that deepens rather than resolves the colonizer's identity crisis and continues to psychologically drive the ongoing pursuit of domination in the name of the empire. Okay, bye everyone. It's been great. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. I hope you learned something valuable from this, and make sure to tune into the next podcast.
Bye, guys. До свидания.